Meantime, we are covering as well the political fallout of this, because there have been many demands for the president's resignation, for his removal from office if he'll be impeached again by House Democrats. So we're bringing in right now Princeton University professor Keith Whittington. He's joining us live at this moment. Professor, can you kind of go into, how unprecedented it would be, essentially, for a president to be impeached twice in one term? I mean, that's never happened before. There haven't been many men who have served as president. So 44 actually. But what's the nature, the territory that the direction we're going in at the moment?
Very many presidents impeached at all, only 3, and none of them were convicted. As we noted during the Trump impeachment, particularly the first time around, it's the first time we've had a president impeached who was elected during his first term of office, in which there was a prospect of him running for a second term of office. Completely unprecedented to even be thinking about impeaching a president a second time around. Obviously, it's a very difficult task, and even more difficult in this context since the president was not reelected, and so he will soon be leaving office again, without the necessity of impeachment and a vote to convict. And so it raises the hurdle as to whether it's worth trying to pursue an impeachment at this late stage. The only thing that's even close to the idea of impeaching one president more than once is the fact that there have been occasions in the past where there have been multiple attempts to impeach a president. Often those attempts don't go very far. But for example, in the context of Andrew Johnson, the very first president to be impeached and almost was convicted in his Senate trial, there were several efforts to impeach Andrew Johnson before they finally found a charge that stuck and was able to build majority support in the House of Representatives. So it's not terribly unusual for there to be a lot of ongoing interest in impeaching a president, several moves to impeach a president, but to actually impeach a president twice is just an extraordinary political action for the House to even be thinking about taking.
Well, I was also wondering, even if they are thinking about it at this moment, they have a very, very short window of time if they wanted to do that. Is it even feasible at this point to be discussing impeachment? Because is there enough time?
Well, I think it's certainly doable. I think the real restraint that Congress faces is a political one. How fast do they want to move? Do they have the votes to move? How long will it take to persuade enough members of both the House and then ultimately the Senate to go along with this effort? Certainly, we're used to impeachments taking a fairly extended amount of time. The Trump impeachment, the first time around, took a fair amount of time, although it moved fairly quickly, as these things go. But we're used to, for example, a long period of investigation where the House is developing facts to support what we think of as analogous to a grand jury indictment in order to bring a case to the Senate. We're also often used to the Senate, of course, having a very extended trial, maybe a little bit of lead time in order to prepare for that trial. In the case of Trump, the trial was cut off, so it didn't even go as long as it might otherwise have, but even then, it was fairly lengthy. But all that's a choice that Congress makes about how long to take in each one of these steps of the process, how much investigation actually needs to take place before a majority of the members are persuaded that they're ready to act. Congress could choose to move much faster. In this case, the kinds of issues that the president is potentially accused of are very public. Everybody already knows them. All the House members already know it. There's no investigating to do. You simply have to put that in front of the majority and see whether or not there's actually support to take the vote. You could do that extraordinarily quickly. And even the Senate trial could be very brief in this context. You need to give an opportunity for the president to defend himself, but that does not have to be an extended process. The whole thing could be done in a matter of a few hours. It doesn't require days, weeks, or months. So if Congress were really persuaded that the president was a serious risk to the country, such that it was intolerable for him to stay in office for even another day, they have it within their authority and within their power to make that happen.
And I was also kind of wondering as well, you don't have to violate U.S. criminal code. It doesn't need to be one of the quote unquote charges brought against a sitting president. It just needs to fit under the purview and definition of whatever you can argue high crime and misdemeanor means. I kind of want to focus our efforts right now, though, in the discussion, because there's another remedy for removal at the moment as well being discussed. And it's not just a rumor and it's not just speculation at this point. Countless Democratic senators have come out and said this needs to happen. And that's the invoking of the 25th Amendment. Can you kind of just go into the background of what it is? How was it even, formulated and passed, I believe, back in the 60s? Right. And has it ever been used before?
Not the relevant provision, although aspects of the 25th Amendment have been used before. So the 25th Amendment is really designed to deal with the possibility that a president might be disabled while in office and not be able to perform his duties, and yet still be the president. And so what do you do under those circumstances? During Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, he suffered a series of heart attacks that left him crippled and unable to perform the duties of his office for an extended period of time during his presidency. He eventually recovered each of those instances, but there were periods of weeks when he was incapable of doing his job. And as a consequence, the White House was a bit of a mess because there was no clear chain of command about who would make decisions. And so you had several White House officials, including Vice President Richard Nixon, making decisions on behalf of the power of in office of the presidency. And as long as everyone agreed, that worked reasonably well. It was very much an ad hoc solution, but there was always this risk that what if you had to make quick decisions and people weren't in agreement, there's no one to call shots. After that, of course, John F. Kennedy is shot and killed. And a lot of members of Congress worried that what if he had not died suddenly, but instead had lasted for an extended period of time in a coma or the like. What would you do under those circumstances? And so it finally convinced Congress you needed some mechanism to remove a president or at least transfer his powers in these kinds of circumstances. So the 25th Amendment is designed in part to deal with the possibility that the president might die or resign. And what do you do under those circumstances? It deals with the possibility of the president voluntarily giving up the powers of his office for a period of time. And presidents have used that provision when they, for example, have had to go under anesthesia for surgery. And so they temporarily pass off the powers to the vice president and then take them back when they have recovered. But it's the final section of the 25th Amendment that's at stake here. And this is when the president is involuntarily removed from his powers. Here again, the real concern was, what do you do about a president who's had a stroke or is in a coma and really incapable of exercising powers? And what the 25th Amendment allows is for the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to make the decision that the president's incapable of exercising the powers of his office and to transfer that authority to the vice president to act in his stead until and if the president recovers. And then it has a mechanism in place for the president to protest that he's now recovered and capable of taking back his power. If the cabinet thinks that that's not true, they can then go to Congress, and Congress can ultimately resolve it. So that's the question here, is whether or not Vice President Pence and the cabinet would come to the conclusion that President Trump is incapable of exercising the powers of his office under the present circumstances. Obviously, he's still walking and talking. He's not in a coma. He's not suffered a debilitating stroke. He would then protest that he is, in fact, perfectly capable of exercising the powers of office. And then the controversy would go to Congress to make a decision as to which side to support. And one feature of the 25th Amendment is Congress has a long time to decide, and in fact, so long that they could wait until after the next inauguration before they would actually have to make that decision.
See, that was personally what I was kind of confused about is the kind of role of Congress in the 25th Amendment. So what you're saying essentially is this has to be first initiated by the cabinet and the vice president, correct? The Congress cannot request this of them.
That's right. It has to be. Well, of course, they can make informal requests, but Congress has no triggering function where they can drive the decision. The decision is ultimately in the hands of the vice president and the cabinet. The 25th Amendment does allow for the possibility of Congress passing a statute to create some other body besides the cabinet that could make these decisions. The cabinet is the default option that's provided for in the 25th Amendment, but Congress has never done that. So they have not set up, for example, a panel of doctors to make this decision. There's sometimes been discussions about doing that through statute. So right now, with the current situation in place, the current laws that are in place, it's the cabinet and it's the vice president who makes that decision. No one can force their hand. It's entirely up to them as to whether to trigger this on their own. And then once they've triggered it, Congress gets into the act if the president objects and appeals to Congress to allow him to take his powers back.
And we should note that we've been following some of the breaking news of the cabinets, out of the cabinet, especially tonight with those resignations of Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos and earlier today Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao. You know, now that I have you here, I just wanted to kind of shift the conversation. Sure. Because you can talk about a lot of these things, and we want to use that here on News Now for Fox, and we appreciate it. But I want to talk about some of the ideas, the charging ideas for some of these protesters, especially the word sedition. And I kind of want to talk about the historical etymology of that word in a framework of the law. What essentially does that mean? Is there a high burden that you have to prove, to prove your case in court for sedition? How has it historically been used as, an allegation and a charge in like a criminal indictment, if you have it?
Yeah, so sedition is a very long-standing concept in the criminal law that we inherited from England, which used a similar framework. And really, it's in its broadest sense, is a catch-all for addressing violence that's exercised against the state. And so lots of activities in which rioters and other sort of mob-like activities, as well as even small conspiracies in which individuals use violence in order to resist state authority, could be charged as seditious. Under English law that was inherited into the United States as well, there was an additional concept often referred to as seditious libel, in which we have narrowed dramatically given our First Amendment. But the idea of seditious libel is that if you use speech to encourage people to undermine or attack the state, and that was understood very broadly in English terms, then that too could make you criminally liable. As I said, because of the First Amendment, we've significantly restricted the ability to which people can be charged with that kind of offense based just on the rhetoric that they use or things that they publish. But the crime of sedition, of actually engaging in violence against the state, still exists in federal law. So I just have it in front of me now. So the U.S. Code specifies, and it offers lots of sort of options as to what can count. Everything from conspiring to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, to levy war against the United States, to oppose by force the authority of the United States, or by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law, or by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States, contrary to the authority thereof. So it covers a lot of bases, everything from levying war against the United States to seizing property. And obviously, in this context, seizing a property is included, as well as other actions that this could take, such that a sedition charge could be levied. And the penalty, as you might imagine, for being convicted of sedition is quite high. And so it's a very serious federal offense. And it's not trotted out very often, but it could certainly be used in this context.
And just lastly for you, Professor Whittington, I kind of just wanted to get your thoughts, your reaction, especially as a, an expert and a student and kind of a scholar in this field of American history. Just your thoughts on what happened yesterday. The historical precedent, I don't think there is one for it, but can you draw any parallels to anything that we've seen before?
It's an extraordinarily dark day for American democracy. There really is not any comparable precedent at the federal level. People are reaching for things like thinking about the Civil War as an example, which certainly is suggestive of just how dramatic this is. Obviously, it's not the same as the Civil War itself, but this idea of Americans in an organized fashion attempting to take the Capitol building and seize it, even if seizing it only for a very short time, is really quite extraordinary. As further reporting has come out and people have been arrested, it's become evident that while some of the people, as we all saw in the photographs and video of the time, were traipsing through the Capitol as if they were on vacation, taking pictures and selfies as they went, there were plenty of people who were involved in that process who were armed, who had bombs with them, who had Molotov cocktails with them, who were doing violence in the process of undertaking it. That's really extraordinary behavior. We have had instances in the not too recent past of terrorist acts committed in and around the Capitol building. I think this is somewhat comparable to some of that. I think the other things you have to reach for in order to find comparable kinds of actions having been taken don't occur at the national level, but instead we'd have to think about state and local actions. So there have been instances, especially after the Civil War and after the Reconstruction period, in which white mobs seized control of local governments that had elected African-American government officials in order to reclaim those towns, mostly smallish cities, reclaim those jurisdictions on behalf of white supremacy. That's an instance in which you have violence exercised precisely in order to seize the government. Several of those were actually successful. But obviously, we're not familiar with that kind of activity occurring at the national level. It really is unprecedented. It's a terrible blow, I think, to our international standing as a democracy, and it's a terrible sign about the state of our current democracy and what we're currently living with. This is going to take a very long time to overcome.
All right, well, Professor Keith Whittington, we thank you so much for joining us here on News Now from Fox, for breaking all of that down just a day after those terrible, terrible protests there at the Capitol and inside. So thanks for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
All right, and this is Andrew Kraft once again, and we want to thank everyone for watching News Now from Fox, and we'll be continuing to follow this story and all its angles in the days and the weeks ahead. Remember, we'll have live coverage on January 20th of the inauguration. Joe Biden will be sworn in as the nation's 46th president, alongside Vice President Kamala Harris as the first woman to hold that office. We'll also be following any more developments and resignations out of the Trump administration. We brought you just about 20 minutes ago the news that Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos has resigned her post from the Department of Education in response to what happened at the Capitol yesterday. That's following the recent resignation as well today of Secretary Elaine Chao from the Department of Transportation. So we're going to take a quick commercial break. We hope you enjoyed that discussion. Obviously, we have to couch all of those discussions. They're just being discussed. They're just being, entertained at the moment. None of that is on the horizon or happening, but it is out there, and we wanted to break it down for you so you understand it in case it does come to fruition. So we'll be back in 2 minutes here on News Now from Fox. Thanks for watching. And this is Andrew Kraft once again. You're watching, that's just a live look at the White House. We heard from the president today in that very short, pre-recorded and taped Twitter message that he put on his account that has since recently become unlocked. We showed you that Twitter video saying that he condemned the violence that happened yesterday at the Capitol, also acknowledging that there will be a new administration come January 20th, essentially conceding to President-elect Joe Biden. The first time that he has done that. Remember, just 2 months ago, November the 7th, the race was called for Joe Biden. And now on January 7th, in the next year, 2 months from them, President Trump has finally conceded. At the moment, we do want to just kind of take a little break. We know a lot of this coverage has been breathless and exhausting of what happened yesterday at the Capitol, but it's been so important because it does not happen hardly at all. Rather, it never has. It's unprecedented.